Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad that you all joined us today. Today is Thursday, so we are very close to Friday, which I'm very excited about. My name is Julia Scott, and I work with Baltimore Racial Justice Action. I'm really excited to have folks here for this conversation around essentially student activism and student protest. And so we have a small group, so we can hopefully have some interesting conversations during our time together today. But we're really excited to have you here. I'm going to have Tammy, who is checking for us today, to pull up some of the slides so we can kind of get started with our intros. So guys, welcome again. Yes, just so you all know, some virtual housekeeping. You are highly encouraged to keep your video on. We are recording, to mute yourself when you're not speaking. However, your voice is definitely encouraged, and welcome as a participant. You can use the chat or during question and answer times, or if you have a question, discussion, you can certainly raise your hand and we can call on you. So please feel free to do that. And just as we do with every single meeting, I think it's just important to let you all know, given the historic and violent nature of racism in this country and how it's been perpetuated on Black and non-Black folks of color, an examination of history will be challenging. And so sometimes you're going to have some very deep conversations or things that might come up. So because of this, we want to make sure we give you a content warning at the beginning of our workshops and our public offerings, like our 13th of the month events. And so because of this US history of violence against Black and non-Black people of color, these conversations might surface for you moments of discomfort, pain, struggle. So we want you to, of course, take care of yourself during this time in ways that do not disrupt the work or learning or these sessions for other folks. And please take a moment and assess whether you're emotionally ready to participate at this time. So once again, we are recording and we are going to be posting this video to our YouTube and to other social media like sites. So just so you know, if you're not able to put your camera on, you are also okay. But we encourage folks, if they are okay with it, to do so. All right, so welcome to Acting Up on Campus, Histories and Mythologies of College Protest. This topic we felt at least was very important for what's going on in our world right now, and some of the reactions to what is happening on college campuses across the country. So we'll go to the next slide. So today, we're going to, just like we did the housekeeping, but we're going to continue to welcome. We're going to do hopefully some audience questions to maybe kind of get some thoughts around this, of why this topic, some topic discussion and closing. I'm hoping that this will be a pretty straightforward, conversation on student activism and student protest. I want to hopefully hear from folks about things that they've heard, or maybe if they have gone to school and they've actually participated in protests on campus, like what was your experience like? I really hope that we can share some of those things. Just to let you all know ahead of time, we will not necessarily be getting into exact topics of what students have been protesting, but rather the history of the protests and how they're actually being regarded on college campuses, in the media, and so on. So not so much like the ideological kind of viewpoint, but rather what is happening, what are we seeing, why do these things happen? So we can go to our next slide. So the first thing I'm going to ask you all to really think about is, what role do you think students play in social change? Is it important, and why or why not? And also, we've put a few pictures throughout just so folks can see other kind of examples of protest that has happened over the years. So that first picture was a picture of students from Morgan State University, my alma mater, or at that time, Morgan State College, who were protesting the Reed's counter in Northwood. We'll get into that a little bit. But yes, this kind of reflection. What role do you think students play in social change? Is it important? Why or why not? Anybody want to share? Karen, did you come off mute?
Hi, I spent probably about two decades in like 9 through 12 education, and now I'm in higher ed. And so it's a really relevant question to me and really a reason why I spent my life in teaching, because I think that students are like the key, the foundation, the ones looking at all the information up fresh a lot of times. A lot of time, like if we're thinking about traditional student ages, this is their world that they're going to have to deal with. So it should be their voices highlighted. And I feel strongly that it's my job in whatever instructional role I have, to support them through like listening, strategizing, providing like access to information, contacts, like whatever I can, while still like keeping it their work and their voice.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. As someone who also works in higher ed, and I also see that you're an LMSW. It's like I'm also a social worker. I've just graduated. Woot woot. And thank you. And yes, like I think that it's so important, when we're talking about like this is their world. And so like I feel like students, especially even like on college campuses, but even younger, right? Because we're seeing high school students who are also protesting, who are also, doing demonstrations and practicing activism, that like they are concerned about the world that they are supposed to like contribute and grow in. So like they do have a lot of questions. And so yeah, I agree with you. It is important. Thank you so much. Did anybody else want to share their thought?
Hi, this is Paris. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I went and got a plug-in camera, and so
Oh.
I think I've solved both the audio and video issues. But you probably can't see me very well, but that is my own
But
self-care.
you look hazy, so it looks like a
Okay.
dream. So it's great.
Yeah, so I am outside and I need that right now. So
Hey.
just grace on that piece. So I would share, and this topic is of particular interest to me right now, not because I work in the school. I'm also a social worker, but in public child welfare. But I have a daughter who is a college student who also participated is actively participating in protests currently. So we have a lot of discussion and processing that, as well as participated in several during high school. And I kind of became involved in some advocacy and support for some of the work that the students were doing at that point, as they were, experiencing the backlash of protesting. So I did not have any experiences with protests that I can really place in the school setting. So only in my adult chapter of life, not in the college campus setting. So that's just me also. Well, anyway, so that's where I am right now.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really cool that like, of course, if you do have children and they are getting involved, like how are those conversations happening between, parents, between families and community and those who are protesting? Especially, I think like the younger they are, I'm sure there's a lot of like, oh, but when they start getting to college, and as we can see with the backlash, it starts to feel a little bit more like, wait a minute, what's going on and how can I support, or should we? I think those questions are very natural to come up. So absolutely.
Sure. I know taking my son to protest when he was young, like maybe like 8. I mean, it was very scary to him, and it wasn't something that he could I mean, it was important that he went and that we then processed it. But yeah, it's a whole different experience as you're a young person. So just
Yeah.
kind of piggybacking on what you shared, like why is it important for at that age? And so, there's the whole like cliche that, the youth are what lead us, or the, young people change the world. And I don't know, I could probably argue the other side of that as well. But I think that they do gain attention and they are change makers, and there is real power in youth voice in a lot of circles. So I think it's extremely important. And you know uh historically, I mean, if you look back in all regardless of what the issue is there, that protest has effectuated change.
Absolutely. We're going to get into some of those histories, so I'm glad you brought that up. So thank you. I'm not sure if Leah wanted to share anything, or if you had anything to share, or.
My dogs are currently having like barking hours, so I've been
Oh,
hesitant to contribute. But I think a lot of what Karen said as well, it's like you come to college to learn, and you're at a time in your life where you're learning new beliefs and establishing your identity and your value system. So when all that comes together with current events, and I feel like there's just so much more um, energy and desire for engagement. You're around other people that have similar values, which you move out of college and that doesn't always remain. So I feel like it's a perfect combination of factors that can lead to that organizing and collective voice.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Like, yeah, like you're right. Like we, like usually for folks in college, like not everyone in college, but the majority a lot of the time they are like really coming into their own, and it's like already kind of a hodgepodge of things that are happening about like identity, about like just kind of like the life experiences, like you kind of think that you're an adult, like, and you are but not really like fully. It's like it's a whole like thing. And so when you're starting to enter and to learn about the world and what this actually means for you as an individual, means for your community or for your family, it's that passion is there, and it can be very beautiful, and it can also be extremely scary. So thank you all for like sharing those. I'm gonna ask Tammy to put the slides back up. And I think throughout this, one of the things that I thought about is, like I said, I mentioned I went to Morgan State. I believe around the time I was in college, there was I'm not sure if folks remember, like the Gen 6 situation was happening. I remember it was one of the first like conversations that like me and other students were having about, okay, like what are we gonna do? Should we be doing something? Particularly going to a historically Black, college and university. It was like for us, like that was a very normal like thing to be passionate about and to discuss. And I also remember being like, well, do I actually want to go out and protest? Like, is that something I want to do? Like, I'm all for it, but that was my experience. I didn't actually, I think, really go to my first protest until after I graduated from college. Those that was my experience. I think I went to like a Trayvon Martin protest, and by that time I had graduated from Morgan, and that was an experience. And so yeah, I definitely understand. All right, so I'm gonna have to go to the next slide, and we're gonna talk about why this topic. So, as I mentioned, student protests have dominated the news cycle for the last month, but really like for the last year, almost year. So these topics have been very normal on college campuses, but past student protests and discussions around free speech and all of that has come up as we're talking about student activism. There's a thing a curator said, it's a website called Walkout, a brief history of student organizing. And the curator said there have been student protests in the United States for nearly as long as there have been students. And so I really, when I was reading that and doing a lot of research behind this topic, I think it's really important for us to remember that even when these things might sound or feel new, they're like literally not. Learning more about the history of protests from bygone eras was very interesting. But it's just important to recognize that universities, institutions have always had people who were questioning, and they questioned out loud. And so that's a very normal part of our history, just like as a world, but also as a country. And so obviously students have protested the civil rights movement, anti-apartheid, divestiture, take back the night, and sexual assault, activism, wars, so Vietnam to Iraq, Black Lives Matter. And as we know, currently the Israel-Hamas conflict war is something that is happening on college campuses and has been causing a lot of discussion. And so while you can usually find parallels in these student movements themselves, you can also, of course, see a parallel of reactions. And so we also want to think about, through this conversation, how does race and identity inform these movements, and what are the myths that we learn as we're, actually going through and listening to like our news or reading articles or having conversations in community with people. I think especially if you are in institutions, if you are in like human services work, like social workers, these conversations are important for people that you work with, as well as people that you might be in community or might be serving. So I think that these are, just kind of why we're talking about this right now and how this is intertwining with our current, news and media sphere. So next slide. So I'm not sure if folks are familiar with Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael, but Kwame Ture, he has a speech called Lessons from the 60s, and we're going to actually listen to some of his words about students, and it's the role of students in revolution. All right, so Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, always extremely intense, even when I'm listening to him, because there are so many things that he says where I'm like, ooh, I don't know. But I really want us to focus on a few things in this speech, mainly what he says the role of students are in revolution, but also what he's talking about as the role of education. And, when we're talking about students, particularly those on college campuses, and what is happening, when they're like protesting, or no matter what the protest may be, and I think Karen also kind of mentioned this before, like they are in a very unique position. You're on a college campus, you're learning all you're supposed to learn. You have like, your classes that aren't geared towards your major. So you're kind of like relearning a lot of things and getting more context. You're learning about what change is supposed to be, how things maybe could be helpful to people. And you are essentially asked during that time to both learn these things and say these things are true, and at the same time, evaluate, right, critique the current systems that we live in, the current world that we live in. And a lot of the times, as I'm sure we have all seen, a lot of the values of the lessons that maybe we have learned about what is supposed to be are not necessarily happening with the systems and the rules that we are living in. And so students, for me, I've always viewed protests as a way of pushing back and saying, well, this is what I'm learning. And since I'm learning this, my action should be this. We should all be talking about this. We should all be fighting for this. But I do want to hear you all's thoughts around Tore's words, anything that stuck out to you, or things that made you uncomfortable, or things that you didn't agree with. Anyone?
I liked what he said about reform comes from the top down, and I can't remember his word exactly, but like more significant or meaningful change comes from the masses, and I think that just applies to so many different things. But I think it's a very meaningful thing to keep in mind regarding change. I feel like sometimes we see things come from the masses, like these protests, and then the top has a response to kind of quell or like quiet that, and then you think that that's the change that's needed, but it's really just pacifies a little bit. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Really
Yeah. I mean, I think that yes, he said the top down versus like, real change happens from the bottom up, not just, just not top down. I mean, I think it's important that he also distinguishes like revolution and reform. And obviously a lot of the things that we see, whether it be around racial justice, or a lot of people are asking for like reforms, which obviously like have their place. And I think it's about studying and trying to make sure that people are okay. And and then there's also, I think, the idea of revolution, like that idea of like actually changing the entire system. And that's the difference. So those are two of the things that I've also like pointed out in this speech. Anybody else? And you can certainly also use the chat. I can read things out if need be.
I would just
You got it. Oh
no, someone's in the chat.
Oh yeah, that was Tammy. Tammy said, I like the unspoken dismissal of the notion of exceptionalism. Yeah, if you want to hear more about that, Tori, I'm sure you can find a lot of speeches and writings from Kwame Tori about that. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Tammy. I appreciate it. Go ahead, Paris. You got it.
I don't know. There wasn't really anything that he said that struck me that I felt like I didn't agree with, or that was like seemed, radical. I liked that his actual like style of speech too, that he repeated the same thing. So he'd say like 3 or 4 lines, and then he'd come back and repeat maybe 2 of the 4, like just to kind of really hone that in. So I feel like that is helpful for audiences when you're talking about something that you're trying to really like wrap your brain around, or differentiate between this, movement or that, or revolution versus reform. But I didn't even pay attention that it was really the title of the video, but when he talked about students being the spark, that kind of connected to what I was saying when I started. It was like, yeah, like students can change, but I also believe in a system that is not that at all times there's the powers that be that are really making decisions. So to me, that was really important, that students in and of themselves are not going to be able to make these changes, but they should be held to the responsibility of being that spark, and then carrying it kind of up. So that resonated with me for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like, he pretty much plainly says that, like, the spark versus, the people that kind of continue, the masses.
Right.
So essentially he's like saying, like, students need your support in order to get these things done. And so the onus is not just on the students to like spark it into question, but rather the rest of us who, are maybe not students any longer, always a student of life, but maybe not like, formally on a college campus or in a classroom, but that we are obligated in a lot of ways to continue to push for those movements. So absolutely. We're gonna go to our next kind of slide, which is it's from CBS News, and it's a quick history of student protests on college campuses.
Students, of course, have
wrong video. And this one is just kind of giving a brief before we get into some of the histories that we wanted to focus on through our discussion today. Right. So this is, of course, like how this has been discussed in the media, which is also, always good to hear. And I think that it's so important for the news to discuss this. But there has been, of course, like there's a huge, much broader history of the history of student protests on college campuses. And we're hoping to go over some maybe you have not heard, or some that you have. I think a few of them are actually, we're having this video. So we can go to the next slide, Tammy. So the history of student protest, it goes back centuries. So I was actually doing some research. 1507, the University of Padua, which is in Italy, the school tried to cancel their Carnival vacation, which is essentially like their spring break, and they rioted until it was restored. So this, this idea that student protests are, just like kind of like those darn kids energy, ridiculous is always very interesting. In 1766, students launched the Great Butter Rebellion in protest of the poor food quality at the school, and half of the student body was suspended. And that was actually, I think, on record, one of the first student protests that they had on record in the United States, which is very interesting. I'm sure there were maybe others, but hey, they said the food sucked and the students were going to protest about it. So what I think that we've all discussed here is that activism is essentially foundational to education and the college experience, but definitely to education, whether that be, you know, in high school, whether that be in a, you know, a community kind of like situation, even from like your relationship with your parents. Like I know my parents would tell me stuff and I would rebel, like, and I would find a way to do that. But the activism, protesting, questioning is normal when learning. And that student activism has shaped the country and higher education itself. Next slide. So for generations, students have pushed for things like improved student life, fighting tuition hikes, which we've definitely seen over the last few years, dismantling discriminatory policies. We saw a lot of that in 2020. And we're also seeing a lot of pushback to that currently. Demanding more inclusive curriculum, same, a lot of that in 2020. Increasing campus safety. And those are just like a few of the things. And they, of course, have pushed for change outside of the university or the institution walls. Next slide. And so, you know, I wanted to go over some of the goals and things that I've, you know, read about. You know, we talk about civil rights, Black college students, a lot of them were doing some of the first civil rights protests on college campuses and local businesses. As I mentioned, so historically, I had to add this slide because I wanted to make sure it's on record and recorded. But a lot of the time when we're talking about the sit-in movement, we start with North Carolina A&T, and that is wonderful. And I love my North Carolina A&T people. But actually one of the first college sit-ins happened at Morgan State College. And so they staged the first successful lunch counter sit-in at Reed's Drugstore, which at that time was in Northwood Shopping Plaza, which is across the street, still from Morgan State University. And, you know, this actually kicked up other protests that happened, you know, starting in the 60s when the civil rights movement continued and started to grow in popularity, particularly around college campuses. So we had the sit-in movement that started in the 1960s at North Carolina A&T when they were, you know, trying to integrate a Woolworth in downtown Greensboro. So we have these four students. So this kicked off other protests. You can go to the next slide. You're good. And then we had, once again, Black college students protesting civil rights, the Orangeburg Massacre, which happened in 1968. A lot of folks may not actually, I'm not sure if people are familiar, but a small group of South Carolina State and Claflin students were protesting all whites only policies at, you know, a bowling alley. And this turned deadly, and a police officer, a highway patrolman, ended up opening fire on 200 unarmed Black students. 3 young men were shot and killed, and 28 folks were wounded. And this event became known as the Orangeburg Massacre. It's one of the most violent episodes in the civil rights movement, but not a lot of people talk about it. In particular, you know, this happened a bit before what we saw happening at Kent State, right? So I want to make sure that we are connecting that in the racial kind of scheme in these discussions, right? We're talking about identity, that a lot of the things that we are seeing now on college campuses obviously have happened in the past. But what we start also kind of recognizing historically is things that are done to folks of color, Black people, those things are happening, and then they are usually used in other groups, right, on the majority. We can go to the next slide. So of course, land use, anti-war militarization protests. Before Kent State, there was also the People's Park protest, which was happening technically at Berkeley, but at a park next to Berkeley. The site of the country's first large-scale anti-war demonstration was happening, and folks were upset. They wanted to use the green space. They were going to turn that into a soccer field, and a lot of the students were not for that. And so the police began to chain the area, and students protested, and the police reacted. And then Governor Ronald Reagan declared a state of emergency, and he actually used this as a way to push as he was running for president. So you start to see that Reagan had a very interesting belief about student protest. He did not believe that students should be up here talking about the war and complaining about these things, and there were laws that they were trying to pass to make it where students would deal with, like, judicial consequences. So that was before Kent State, and so we see that what happened in People's Park, what happened in Orangeburg, it begins to become normalized, police presence. So in Kent State, as it was mentioned in the video, and I think we just had like the 50-something anniversary of it, I believe. Students protested the expansion of the Vietnam War, the draft, and the National Guard actually being on campus, and 4 students were killed and others were injured. That's what that picture is from, rather. Next slide. And then, we're currently, one of the biggest things that I've seen in the news is the way that students are actually protesting. I think that a lot of the time we have a very distinct idea about what protests are supposed to look like, and what is a good and what is a bad protest. So as we mentioned earlier, folks were sitting in, folks would be marching, and the civil rights movement for a lot of people has been used as the blueprint for what protest is supposed to look like. Obviously, that is a very limited view of the civil rights movement, but I do think it's important to point out that is still used, today in the discussion as a way of shaming other folks for how they protest, especially, you talk about Black Lives Matter, or even some of the protests we're seeing right now on college campuses. We know that in 1968, Columbia University students, they occupied Hamilton Hall in protest of the Vietnam War and the increased gentrification that was happening around the school, which is interesting, and I feel it's a whole other 13th event, but very interesting. And in 1969, Morehouse, a year after Dr. King's assassination, Morehouse students were upset about the school curriculum administration. They locked down the campus and took board members hostage, one of whom happened to be Martin Luther King Sr. And funny enough, Samuel Jackson was one of the students. And I believe that Martin Luther King Sr., I think he was beginning to have a heart attack. They were like, get him out of here because we don't want to get locked up for that. So they let him out. So they opened up the doors to let him out. But Samuel Jackson, yes, he is a Morehouse, was a Morehouse student, and he ended up, I think, being expelled for that. But that this idea of occupying buildings, while we may not necessarily agree with it, that's totally fine. But this is not actually a new type or new thing that is happening. Another slide for this one, next one. So we know in today's world, we've seen, and this list can be, I can add so much more, but like women's rights have had a lot of discussions and debates and protests. Occupy Wall Street at one time was a pretty big, protest on college campuses, Black Lives Matter, and of course we have the Israel-Hamas war that is currently happening in current discussion. Are there any stories or protests that you all have heard about, or that anything on this list that you didn't know about? And I know that people had said that maybe they did or did not actually protest, but we know this history is long. What do you all think about the civil rights movement, how that's kind of used as a blueprint, and how this is like shifting and looking based on race and culture and whatnot? I want to hear from some folks about that.
It always sticks out to me how sanitized the versions we get are, which I
Yes.
guess like there's a whole nother level in there about like what does education look like if the version we're getting is sanitized. And just this like mythos we have around like there were agreed upon goals and tactics and it was clearly the thing. And I think that we both lose so much as organizers when we don't have that messy history,
Mm,
and also that it like really skews public expectations of what protests should be, because they like it's never been clean and clear. It's always been messy, and yet that messiness is used to invalidate the protest itself.
absolutely. Yes. Thank you for saying that, because for one, the sanitized history is so important to discuss because it does impact organizers. One of the things I've certainly seen, I remember when Black Lives Matter protests, before I think it became so much of an organization, but just people using it as like a rallying cry. And people were looking for leaders. People were like, well, where is like your MLK? You know, like, where are these people? Like, we need this, we need structure. And, you know, I've read a lot about MLK. I've read a lot about, you know, the civil rights movement in general. And let me tell you how many leaders there were in that fight who we do not hear about. And more importantly, that like not everybody was a fan of MLK, right? It's like, you know, when he went down south, SNCC had been doing a lot of work. And they were like, why are you coming here trying to take advantage of all the work that we've been doing? Like, you know, like so there's always messiness. And so like I think that anytime a large group of people, especially, are getting together, there's going to be messiness. Like ego is going to play a lot in those things. You know, like, and it's important for us to recognize the humanity in that and why it's important. All the, you know, the more reason to, when you look at the civil rights movement, to praise elements of it, because people were able to say, okay, we're gonna try to all get on one accord. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. And also, yes, like the sanitized history does something, I think, to our viewpoint. It's just kind of regular everyday people. If you're in traffic and people are protesting and people say, oh, like, you know, this should not be allowed. Like, you know, this is like so disruptive. And I'm always like, well, that's kind of the point. The point is that if you're sitting in traffic because you're trying to get home and these folks are protesting something and you're like, oh, well, I just want to get home. It's like, well, then maybe you should be like, can y'all give these people what they want or something? Because this is holding up my life. That's the point, right? Like the whole point of a protest is to disrupt. If it was not to disrupt, then it's just, you know, that's just a play. Like you're just out there doing stuff for no reason, right? It's like, you know, like you want to actually get people to enact change. So thank you for bringing up those really, really salient points. Anybody else? Okay, so have another audience question. We kind of started talking about the pushback. What are some of the other things that you all have heard against student protests? Especially I think for what we were seeing a lot of younger white students. And when they are getting involved in protests that I think either includes, for one, Black people or folks of color, but are really directly questioning the status quo of our country and the way that it operates. What are like some of the pushback that you have heard, whether it be in the news or from your community? You know, what are you hearing? You can go to the next slide, Tammy. Anyone?
Heard like a lot of students are misled or indoctrinated. I've heard even that they're cosplaying oppression. Is another thing that I've heard, which is interesting. But yeah, just mostly like misled or um, social justice warrior kind of vibes as well.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a big one. Cosplaying the social justice warriors. I have been called that on social media. I was just like, oh, like at first I thought it was like a really good thing. I was like, oh, okay, cool. And then I was like, oh, like you mean that it's like a mean thing. Like, okay. Yeah, so yeah, social justice warrior, cosplaying, folks are, indoctrinated. I've heard a lot of those discussions, particularly around this topic and topics around like Black Lives Matter. It's like about indoctrination. Everything is like, at least from my viewpoint, like socialism is usually used as like like they're communist, socialist, like Marxists. I've heard Mark's name a lot in the last, I don't know, year and a half, and it was not happening in my classroom. It was happening on the news with politicians, which is very interesting. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would say similar reflections, just that it's usually the discussions that I hear are that like it becomes like a protectiveness of the student, like, oh, they're vulnerable, they're being somebody else is pushing their agenda on them, right? So the school people have ulterior motives and their own agendas, and they're taking advantage of these kind of young immature minds to move their agendas forward.
Absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. You can go to the next slide, Tammy. So yes, along with what you all have said, student safety has been, I think, one of the biggest discussions. I'm not sure if people were following the latest protests that were happening at Columbia University, but before they brought the police in, Eric Adams, the mayor, he was like, first he started seeing, he said, these children needed our help. And like they are, this is a safety concern. There were outside agitators, like who were doing this. I even heard like, who's buying, these tents, they're buying them in bulk, like someone's doing this. It was just like, really? I mean, like Amazon unfortunately makes it very easy to get like a tent within like a day. Like I mean, it's not that difficult, and the tent was not that expensive. Or they were talking about like the chains that they use. Like, oh well, they like are these like chains that students would use? And it was like those are bike chains, like they're bike locks. And actually, Columbia was selling them, like saying, "Hey, you should get them for your bike" on their website. So, another thing that I've heard is that, of course, students don't have the full story. We're not directly impacted, or other issues to worry about. So, like, why aren't they worried about this? Like, why aren't they talking about this? And this is not what education is for. And so, this is, I think, ultimately the histories and the myths. One of the things that I think I came to in my own kind of like, through my own research is just that a lot of the real debate is about like what education is actually for. Like, what is the role of education in this country? What is it, what does it actually mean to be educated, especially I think in an American college institution? And that is a real question that I think people, should be also listening for. That they are actually talking about a lot of this is like, well, what is the role of education? Like the role of education is supposed to do this. And I'm like, no, like, I'm wondering, um, like, I'm wondering what we think education is supposed to be. I thought it was about, of course, not just, of course, you getting a job after you graduate, but really about making you a better citizen, a better human being, making it so you're able to live and navigate this country and to do good, right? To help people, to make sure the people in your community are supported and have what they need. But a lot of what I have been hearing, and this is probably a 13th event for maybe later this year, is about like the difference between education and indoctrination and what is happening, I think, to young students on college campuses. This is why we're seeing a pushback in DEI work. If we're not talking about those things, it's about indoctrinating students into whatever they think DEI actually is. I'm not sure. we're indoctrinating them. We're talking about gender. You know, we just had the Kansas City Chiefs person speak at a graduation, and you know, to actual students who paid money, and tell like essentially the woman in the audience like, this degree, but like you will really enjoy being a wife. So like, you have these kind of this very polarized view of what education is, and that has really come up a lot in these conversations in regards to the student protests and student activism in general. And so I want us to think about some of the myths. We can go to the next slide. The myths of what it means, you know, when we're talking about protest, when we're talking about social change or social justice. Identity is a huge part of this conversation. Obviously, BRJA, we talk a lot about race. We talk a lot about racism and anti-Blackness in particular. And a lot of the conversation about this, when protesters' interpretations are essentially challenged, you know, I think a lot of people think that they're doing something as like some like DEI race, like everything's about race now. But it is a huge part of our country. And it's not the only part of identity that is, I think, coming up in these discussions. Obviously, religious and spiritual identity is a huge part that is coming up in debates. Talking about our class systems, you know, our essentially our foreign policy is you know, a discussion, but that can connect to people's identities. So the response for this kind of these myths around identity, the demonization, you know, they're told they're violent, there might be anti-Semitic, there might be racist, and they're not about people being able to coexist or work together. I know that there are certainly, I think, in every protest, historically and even current ones, where there are people who are in those spaces that believe maybe pretty radical or extreme things. Most of the time, that's not the bulk of what the protests are usually about. So demonization is like one of the biggest things. Altruism, you know, people are like protesting the fact that like this doesn't have anything to do with you. So like, why are you doing this? Like, this is not important to you. This doesn't impact you. But if we're talking about humanity and our and social justice, like if something is impacting you, it does actually impact me. Maybe not right now, but like certainly down the road it will. So that example that I used earlier about the Orangeburg massacre with those Black students who were protesting civil rights. And then we see, you know, a few years later, the idea of police, you know, or the National Guard at Kent State showing up is normalized, right? Like, you know, Reagan is normalizing like police presence and them attacking students. And we see that once again, you know, policing what we saw at Columbia, or I believe with another West Coast, might have been Stanford or another one of those schools, where students were like arrested, right? It's like, you know, and not peacefully arrested either. So we see this idea that this doesn't impact me, or this issue may not impact me, but that we know that's not the case, right? So these things are impacting all of us. Students are unaware, so we have a tendency to make them children, we make them infants. We know that, like I mentioned, you know, the mayor, oh, well, they're babies, you know, they have to be protected, we care about them. And while I certainly think there should be discussions about if you're bringing children to protest, like actual children, and how that should go, you should certainly have a plan of action. A lot of students, you know, are not actually unaware of what's happening in the world. A lot of the time, not only are they learning about it in the classroom themselves, but they are also usually directly impacted. So obviously you have something like, even like I said, I'll use like is the Israel-Hamas like conversation, like there are Jewish students who are impacted directly by this, as well as Palestinian students who are directly impacted. We saw earlier, like I think this year or late last year, there were, I believe, like either Palestinian or Muslim students that were attacked. I think it was in Chicago. Like that is a real like impact, right? So this idea that they're unaware that they're just kind of babies that need to be protected is not the reality. And we have to talk about, who gets that, that kind of like like making them babies. Who is actually done to that? Like, usually you see a lot of white students, who are like they're made children, and then you might have like Black students or other students of color. That is not necessarily how they are discussed, right? And then, of course, the historicism, um, you know, we think they make a lot of us feel like they are part of a world-changing event, which I think a lot of us can be. But they're just like, that's not real. Like there's only social, the theory that social and cultural phenomena are just determined by history. That's why you saw students, at Columbia who were occupying, was it Hines or Hens Hall? That was occupied also during the Vietnam War protests. Like I said, not new. But the students knew that. A lot of other folks did not seem to make that correlation. So these are just some of the myths that we hear, or that we kind of, I think, interpret in our news, into our own systems. And I want us to kind of like just be aware of those mythologies and what they create. Karen kind of actually got to one of the other major points of this, is that when we learn these myths, when we hear them, we're not able to actually critique them realistically. They cause all sorts of problems, not just for the protesters or future organizers, but for all of us to think about what it actually takes to make change, right? It's like, so whether it be around, something as simple as getting something on your street changed, or to bigger social implications for our country or for our communities, it is not an easy thing to do. And there are going to be people who take various modes in operation to get that done. But if we're not honest about what protest is and what the history of it is, whether it be students or anyone else, it puts us in danger, I think, of not actually doing any type of change, of thinking that things stay the same. You do this when you're young, and then you just kind of like stop. And that's just not what the realistic goal is. Next slide. So we've talked a little bit about the histories and some of the myths, and then reactions and impact. So what we've kind of come to is that America has a very short memory. We have a very short memory of how this country came to be in 2024. We think about protest as, something that is important. I think we see it in a historical lens as something that brought a lot of change. And I think in today's world, it is looked at with a little bit more like fear for a lot of people, particularly. And so we're not telling the full story. The civil rights movement, it's not like MLK came up and he just started talking. Women's rights, they didn't just start talking one day and they were like, you got them. These were years and years and years of work, years and years and years of protesting and writing. And they grew in size, right? They didn't always start out as these kind of gigantic things. Student protests also evokes these other larger topics that we've kind of discussed. Free speech discussions, a lot of that has been under attack. I think it's important to connect these other kind of larger issues that are, being evoked, because I think it goes to show there's usually a larger conversation that has to be had. I know I had a conversation with someone about current protests, and I was like, wherever you fall on either side, I think it's important to recognize that this is playing into a lot of anti-DEI, anti-racism discussions, and folks who are, a lot of Republican, conservative, are using this as like a, see, You know, this is why we should be banning books. This is why we should not be talking about race. This is why we shouldn't be talking about gender. So they're using this protest as a way of not only further polarizing people, but to actually further their agenda. Suppression and policing, once again, policing should always, I think, be a part of the discussion and how we are suppressing not just students, but the thoughts of anyone that might disagree with what is happening in our country, or laws or policies. Race and identity has been, of course, I think, a large discussion around Israel Hamas, but also past protests. That is always at the intersection and always interplaying with how things operate in this country. So I think it's always important to make sure we're censoring those things. And once again, what the point of education actually is. Is it to educate people? Is it about indoctrination? Is it about, getting students prepared for jobs? What is it actually for? And I really had a good time kind of like researching a lot of that and getting into it. But this is something that I think we have to think about. How is this going to impact us in the next year? We'll have an election coming up in November. And we have two very interesting sides people to choose from. And I think that all of these things are definitely a part of that larger conversation. But things like free speech, policing, race and identity, and education are certainly, I think, up for grabs. And it's important, as we're talking about whether it be student activism or book burnings, that we have to know it's not just about the student protests, but it's about these larger things as well. That, if we're suppressing this group, it's a lot easier for us to suppress larger groups, in the future. Like, that's the point. And that protesting should be just kind of a very normalized part of who we are in this country. It certainly has, impacted our ability to make real change, but it is something that we should be, I think, whether we agree with it or not, really making sure that we're supporting and protecting folks who are doing it. I know Paris had to leave, but I think what she had said about, like talking to our children, that's really important. And one of the other things that really came up as someone who works on a college campus, university campus, next slide, is the role of professors or faculty and staff. I pulled these two quotes from an article that was talking about protests at UCLA, I think was the college I was mentioning earlier. And David Turner, he said, if we don't dialogue about these issues, if we can't do that at a university, where we're supposed to have a robust exchange of ideas, where we're supposed to be able to disagree in safety, build and work with one another, then we get situations like this. He was talking about the over-policed, students, and how, their protests were essentially like bombarded. And lastly, this one by Stephen Thrasher that I really loved. He said, I teach about social justice and journalism. I teach about LGBTQ issues. So to me, this is the job. These two professors were behind their students. They were protecting their students. Some of them were actually standing in between their students and the police. And so I really think it's interesting what we're actually seeing and what professors, folks who are working on college campuses are saying about what is happening. College is supposed to be a place of exchange of ideas. It's supposed to be a place where we can disagree in safety and we can work together with each other. But if we aren't able to have those dialogues, if we're not able to actually push when things are not, what we say they should be, then we get situations where students are being locked up or beaten. And that also, it's part of the job, at least in my opinion, it certainly is. If you are someone at a university, I think it is part of your job to make sure that these conversations end, that students are protected, right? So I would love to hear, I know I've talked a lot about history and myths and reactions and impact, but I would like to hear from other folks just about what their thoughts about this information. Aaron, you got the floor.
The indoctrination thing, just like, I have to like work to get the back to words, because it's like, if it were indoctrination, like, there wouldn't be a protest happening on a college campus and the administration like pushing, like,
Yeah.
you want to say that's indoctrination? Like, so I mean, it makes me bonkers. But then also I think it's really like well summed up in these quotes, the idea that like, okay, so if you don't like the way protest is happening or the way people are phrasing things, doesn't that just say we all need more practice at these conversations?
Yeah.
So you should be like, yes, like, let's like go education system. This is the purpose.
Yeah.
I have a really hard time taking a breath and engaging in the indoctrination things because it's just so ludicrous to me.
I hear you. Also, I feel seen. Yeah, I think that it is really important for us to kind of be like, well, I mean, yeah, like this is why we should be having more of these conversations. This is why we should be pushing for more dialogue around these topics. And, you know, like I think that there can be a space of, do we have to agree on every single part of this discussion? And you know, but can we also maybe agree that some changes need to be made here? Now, of course, Torre would say that is a reform, right? And yeah, like that's fine, I think. Like you can say that's a reform. But I also think that, like, you know, that is part of the work of changing the world. Like it is a lot of dialogue, and when the dialogue doesn't work, people are going to fight, right? It's like, and so I think we saw with a lot of the universities, you know, we saw with, I know with Columbia and some of the other ones, students were asking about these things, and then they said, okay, well, if you don't, this is what we're going to do. Like this, like, you know, it is there is a process that usually happens. But I definitely think that the idea that we can't exchange ideas, you know, it's supposed to be a safe space to do so, and folks were calling this indoctrination, and that there are outside agitators who are doing it. I just think it speaks to a very not so much confused, but just disingenuous just view of education and ideas. Because man, I'm like, we would be here all day and all night if I was to put all the history of protests and how they, you know, they have been discussed in media, and which protests, you know, like there was a point you would see Black folks protesting, it was violent. Other folks protest, we see like, oh, you know, they were out here fighting for this, and it was just like, well, wait a minute. Depending on how we're supposed to think, I think about certain topics, that's how it gets covered in the media until it becomes massive. But certainly I think the education conversation and education versus indoctrination conversation is a heavy one that I think we're probably going to see a lot more of in the coming months, unfortunately. I don't know. Leah, or I'm not sure if you or your doggo have anything to say.
He has a lot to say, but
Awesome.
not his time. Yeah, I don't know. I am thinking a lot about like what we learned in school growing up, and I feel like Kent State is like the only thing we formally learned about as far as student protests, and that was white. Or as far as like what I maybe we learned about more, but like as far as what I carried with me. So, and that was a very white picture of what had happened. And so, and then when we think about like the Martin Luther King, I just more of the same what we've been talking about, the democratizing of it and the like envisioning it all as peaceful protests and just the way it is. Then how the narrative shifts to keep it something that I can't think of the words, but just the narrative becomes so watered down to something.
Yeah.
Loses
Yeah,
the meaning of the original issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really important for us to talk about sanitation of protest, mainly because like, like I think Karen has mentioned, and just like what it does to all of us. So like that's not real history. And also that like I think and I've seen we have a event coming up, I think next month about like, media, the role of the news and media, but also that like there's various sides to all of these issues. And I think it's important when we're seeing students, there are students who are protesting on both or multiple sides of an issue. We should be learning about all of them. I think in order to be informed, whether we agree with them or not, I think that it's important for us to be able to reckon with like what people think or what students are thinking and saying, because like they are like coming into the world. They are going to be voters, but even more so, they are coming into a world that is confusing. I think that anyone you graduate from, university, it's confusing. But we are definitely living in a different world than it felt like when I was that age. There are a lot of things that were totally okay for me being abortion rights. That's shifting depending on where you are. So like students are going to protest. Students do have things to say. This impacts them. So I think it's important, it behooves all of us to kind of think about these things more broadly. And because students are getting the information, it's kind of like a Prometheus thing. They're at the kind of beginning, they're getting all the info, and then they're like, okay, well then why is this happening? We're going to use this information. You say we can protest, we're going to protest. We can't be surprised by that. We can't be shocked by that. And that protests, I think the way we talk about voting, we should also be talking about how protests have shaped this country and this nation. This wasn't just people's, lives didn't just get better because someone said, oh, okay, I see that you're a human and you also deserve. Like people have had to fight for, everything. 40-hour work week, I might complain about it, but it was worse. And somebody had to fight for that. It wasn't always like that, right? Like we're seeing right now child labor laws. Like people fought, and now like those things are being rolled back. So things aren't just given, right? Like people had to argue, people had to be in the streets. It's important for us to get like this history correct when we're telling it, so people know why they have certain things in their lives, and that if it's something that they don't like, they can change it. I think it's very important. Next slide, Tammy. So lessons learned. I think for me, education is both theory and practice. As someone, like I said, who just graduated with their MSW, and as the daughter of a teacher, part of education is not just the learning and the information you get from the books, but it's actually putting those things into practice. And I feel like for a lot of students, whether, like I said, whether I agree with a protest or not, I'm always really just like happy and like, wow, like overcome with emotion. I think seeing students really start practicing what they're learning and applying it in a way where they can be heard and they're forced to listen and are like, we're not backing down from it. I think that's something that as you get older, you can sometimes feel like you lose. And that's why I think that Kwame Ture talks about them being the spark, that it can't just be them. Like the rest of us have to get on board to make sure that we follow it through. But the education is not just the book learning, it is the actual practice. That's why if you're going to get an MSW, you're not just learning stuff in a book, you are actually in, your field practicum doing work. to actually practice these things that you're learning and to pay attention, to like maybe make changes or to ask questions. Our oppressions are actually linked. Obviously, I think if you've worked or done anything with BRJA, we know that. So when we're talking or seeing protests, a lot of the things that students do bring up, very well informed, is that how oppression is actually a linked, system, right? So if this person over here, if Karen doesn't have certain rights, I might have the rights today, right? But there's no guarantee I will have those rights next week. And so if Karen is saying, hey, I need the rights to do X, Y, Z, it would behoove me to not only listen to her, but to recognize how my humanity is linked with hers, right? And that is something that I think I've heard a lot with current protests and past protests of reading, that like we are talking about humanity and what it means to be a human, to be a safe human. And unfortunately, because our world is shaped by race and identity and, other forms, classism, other forms of oppression, some people's voices are heard more than others. And so it takes all of us, especially if you come from a marginalized identity or a privileged identity, to make sure you are speaking up and making space and making noise for that. I think that a lot of students, that is where their passion comes from. Like, this is wrong. I wouldn't want it to happen to me. And even though this is not happening to me right now, who's to say that it can't happen? We should be doing better, blah, 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 blah. And that is, something that I've heard a lot of the protesters kind of talking about. And as I mentioned, I was, replying with Leah's comment, history teaches us to resist. I think it's important for us to remember that there is a history all the way, from Italy, whether it be on colleges or we talk about slave rebellions. Resisting is a normal, I think, and natural way of making sure that you are able to live a life of dignity and respect, and to do that safely. Like, I don't take what my ancestors fought for lightly. And so I think it's important for me to continue that. But I also think, though that's not the only part of my identity. And so when I'm learning about other groups or other histories, and I hear something happening, I want to make sure that I am as informed and helpful as possible. So I think that that's a three of the lessons that I've learned, kind of like going through this history and mythology piece. But I would love to hear if there's any other kind of lessons that you've learned or thought about in the last, hour and some change, or just like, I think, watching the news when you're hearing these stories. Anyone, before we start to wrap up?
Back to the Teray video, I really appreciated the phrase about like, yeah, you can go to college and learn how to make ruthlessness not look ruthless.
Yes.
And that to me connected so much to a Freire quote that is like kind of a foundational for me, and think about that. Yeah, you can have education that's an exercise of domination.
Absolutely.
That's indoctrination. It indoctrinates students, I think it says, to adapt to the world of oppression. Why we have to have liberatory practice as education. And also just the like how weighty and how amazing it is to think, that seat in education belongs to the community, no matter who's up sitting there. And Toni Morrison talks about like your education not being like grab bag candy game or something. That like that whatever you got, like you've got to use that. That's like it belongs to the community.
Yes.
And so I just think for me that's the thread through like the 3 lessons learned that you have.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, like absolutely. That yeah, Torre talks about that, saying this is a seat, like it's not just your seat, like yes, but it belongs, it's such a wider viewpoint, I think, of what it means to make it into a place, and like that there were so many other people who helped you get there, and that it's important for you to bring that information or to use those skills in your own communities to better them, right? You know, that, and that means that like it's not just for, you know, that it's for society. Like that's the point. And yeah, I definitely I want to just thank you for that. And yes, and Toni Morrison, she talks about it's important for you to bring that back. Once you get some power, it's important for you to make sure that other folks have that as well. And that is extremely important, very difficult, but extremely important. And I think a role as an educator or as someone who is educated. And that is both formal education and informal education, folks. I want to make sure that we recognize that while we're talking about college campuses, this I think can be for any educator or someone who is being educated. You know, like a lot of my best lessons didn't happen in a four-year institution, but like in community with other folks, just like practicing and living and learning. And it's important for us to bring those experiences and knowledge as well. Lee, did you have anything to add or? All right. There are two more slides. This last video, this is a professor. She, Tiffany Willoughby Herard. She wrote a book called Waste of White Skin, the Carnegie Corporation and the Racial Logic of White Vulnerability. And she was protecting students, you know, who were in the current protest. And she said this about the police that were coming in. And I think that it kind of just sums up something that I've thought about. So ultimately, I think what's really important about what Dr. Willoughby Herard said was, you know, what is my job if the students don't have a future? And I think that it's important that students, that we recognize that that's what students are saying, right? Whether it be about civil rights, whether it be about, you know, tuition hikes, whether it be about wars abroad, you know, or even wars that are domestic, right? Like, I think it's important that when we're thinking about students, they are entering into a world, they have got to breathe the air, they have got to eat the food, they have got to work in the conditions that we are voting and talking about right now. And, you know, I remember when I went to Morgan, I thought I was an adult, and it was great. And then, you know, there's a moment when you get into like the world and you're like, oh, I'm out here working. This is a little bit different than what I thought. And you were truly impacted. You were like, you realize like, oh, I remember having these discussions, but you didn't always connect about how this would impact you. And so we have got to make sure, I think that, you know, we remember that students at the heart of a lot of these things, it's not just about humanity, it's about, we want to be able to survive this world. And that means that we have to think about the laws and the ideas that are shaping it. We want to have conversations that are actually going to better the world that we're walking into, better the spaces that we're leaving for the next folks who are coming in. And so at the heart of that, as someone who works in education, you know, what is my job if the students don't have a future, right? That's something I really wanted to make sure that I shared and got across. So in closing, you can go to our last slide for this topic. I think, you know, it's important to recognize that the world has gotten wider and more connected. Students are getting information, are like able to get information from everywhere. They're able to see things, they're able to read things. Now, I will say not everything that people are reading. Please make sure you are checking your where you're getting information from. But I think that as the world is more connected, you will see more connections on multiple sides of an issue. And it's important that we are listening to all of them to continue to grow and hopefully become a better society. And I think one of the last questions I had was, you know, like, what is democracy without protest, and what is education without questioning? You know, we can't talk about democracy if we're not talking about when people do not agree. It can't just be we all are over here like singing Kumbaya, but that protest is a part of a functioning democracy. When people aren't protesting, or rather if they're not, you know, saying, hey, wait a minute, red flag, we have some questions. We have some other issues, I think, when we're not able to do that. I think that students are making us remember about, like, this part of democracy is also very important. It's not just about the voting, but that something else that Torrey has also said is that, you know, your political education is every single day, not just for a time, you know, every, you know, 4 years. And what is education without questioning? And how can we bring real change if we aren't able to question our current realities? That's what students are. That's what I think education actually is. And that's what I think social change is supposed to be. Real change is, this is beautiful, this might be great. What can we do to you know, make it better? But we have to question our current realities first. I want to thank you all just for your time and your energy, and hopefully a lot more thought around just like student protests and how they are being shaped in our society and in our conversations. We do have there is I think a slide, Tammy, for our conversations with BRJA, a June event that's happening next week. It's called Robbing Employers or Increasing Productivity, the 4-day work week. That's going to be on June 18th at 10 a.m. And you can register for that on the BRJA Eventbrite. And after that, we have a few summer events. Our next 13th of the month in July is going to be mainstream media. Are we being informed, entertained, or indoctrinated? That word again. That's going to be July 13th. That's a Saturday at 11 a.m. And then on Tuesday, August 13th, we're going to have Black August, uplifting the history of resistance behind the walls. That's going to actually be in person at the Pratt Central Library. So we hope to see folks in person to get folks outside of the little box, the Zoom box. And, you know, we hope to see you at those events. All right. And if you want to support us financially, you can certainly do that. There's a QR code. Oh, Tammy, can you put that up really quickly? If you would like to continue supporting our work. And there it is. We try to, of course, have monthly events like these where we're talking about history, where we're kind of having conversations. And we also do other trainings. So if you want to do any kind of work to help us to continue this work, please do consider, you know, supporting us with a one-time donation or a monthly donation. That would be lovely. And so you can